You're listening to Deconstructive Criticism. My name is Aron Flam, and today I will talk to a professor of sociology at Stockholm University who has studied, among other things, gender scientists. And no, I did not say gender. Charlotta has instead studied gender scientists, like any good sociologist would when encountering a new and exciting tribe of people. We're going to talk about and around two of her many studies. The first is about social scientists' political views and how and if it affects their research and society as a result. And the second is a study of whether gender sociology has insulated itself and become blinkered. Hopefully I will also find out what the words insulated and blinkered mean, and so will you if you listen closely. The social media storm is still raging just beyond our screens. Sweden is still Yves Klein Blue on Google Trends. We are at 100, and as I'm writing this, the closest competitor is the Netherlands with a measly 36 points. Get a life, Dutch. Most people now just say that they hope it leads to something good in the end. Hope, as I'm sure you've heard, is the last thing to abandon man. If I was a nihilist, I'd scoff and say that then they have nothing left, but since I'm not a nihilist, I believe that hope has a value. I believe that it has a negative value, but a value nonetheless. Hope is evil. For me, hope is referral of responsibility for your situation to another person or entity, the strong leader, God, the state, or my psychoanalyst. In the original story of Pandora, you know her as the girl with the box full of evils. They actually managed to close the box in time to trap at least one last remaining evil. And according to the story, that evil was hope. To the Greeks, that was the only evil not let out into the world, but something we carry inside us. So when people tell me that they hope it leads to something good in the end, I see it for what it is, something that rendered them incapable to deal with the situation. By clinging to hope, they are actually worsening the situation. But we will leave that for now and focus on the ideology that lies behind a lot of what we're seeing expressions of right now. Regardless of what you think of it personally and regardless where it all leads eventually, gender studies, or as it is called in Sweden, being the mothership of this particularly virulent strain of socialism, gender science is state religion. If you're an English speaker, I have recorded episodes previously about this, in English among others with Harald Eja, a comedian, sociologist and TV journalist who has made a TV series called Hjernevask, or Brainwashed, about gender science in Norway. Since he produced that show, funding for a Nordic cooperation on gender policy was closed down. Unfortunately, it just receded back to where the cancer came from, Sweden. It now resides at Gothenburg University, where it costs us a fortune and produces evil, sexist policies. I have also interviewed Christina Hoff Sommers, Cassie J, and Jan McVarish on this subject, and links to the AI episode as well as the others will be found in the description below this episode on Patreon. And a link to the Patreon will be in the description below whatever platform you're listening on. We call it the Secretariat for Gender Research. They have now been tasked with gender mainstreaming. And it is that process, gender mainstreaming, that is now threatening academic freedom at all Swedish universities. In reality, this process has been going on for a long time, and the only reason it's become a debate here now is that finally someone protested. Erik Ringmar, a senior lecturer at Lund University, refused to include Judith Butler in the syllabus for his course, simply because it had nothing to do with the subject he was teaching, specifically reactions to modernity at the turn of the last century, which, as I'm sure you understand, is a bit before Judith Butler. But as part of the gender mainstreaming process, all course reading lists must now have at least 40% female authors, which is a fine goal, but impossible in some subjects. Oppressive patriarchy's fault or not, the literature just isn't there. Ironically, when Judith Butler was asked about it, she also thought it sounded like a shit move. Ivar Arpi, a Swedish journalist whom I've had on the show before, albeit in Swedish, wrote about it and about the gender mainstreaming process threatening academic freedom here. He also made an English version of it that was published on Quillette that you can read if you want to. And as all the other links, even the ones in Swedish, it can be found in the description below the episode on Patreon. And he has also been interviewed about this by Jordan Peterson. That can be watched on YouTube. Ivar wrote that gender science behaves like an almighty church, forcing people to preach their ideology and calling critics right-wing, misogynist, or if worse comes to worse, men. Instead of answering Ivar Arpi's claims, the Secretariat for Gender Research responded with an article in Dagens Nyheter, the other of Sweden's biggest dailies, calling anyone who criticizes gender science alt-right, misogynist, and white sexist men. They didn't respond to a single argument that he presented, not about suppression of academic freedom, not about behaving like a religion rather than a science, nothing. Instead, they talked about an anti-gender movement, the alt-right, dark forces, Russian involvement, conspiracy theories. If it weren't in print, you'd think some insane homeless person was yelling incoherently at you, proving that Ivar Arpi might have a point. And I know this sounds harsh, but it isn't. They didn't even sign the article with their names. It's just signed 3 officials for the Secretariat of Gender Studies. When government officials stop signing documents with their name, something is usually a bit fishy. They start the article by writing, and I quote, "Let us establish once and for all, gender science is science." And then they go on to state that the only reason they are being criticized is because they criticize white men who are sexist because they are men, and possibly because they are white, and therefore they are a science. The official Swedish feminism, and I call it official because it is state ideology, is a special blend of the worst forms of social constructivism, where gender is fully socially constructed, paired with Marxists' ideas of power, where the woman is always the victim and the man is always the perpetrator, oppressed and oppressor, at the same time as they admit that male biology is bad, or at least male norms are. They are toxic. And of course, homosexuality is biological. That is not a choice. So to accuse it of being a religion surely makes more sense than accusing it of being overly dependent on the laws of logic. To make it even more complicated, there is an ironically absolute form of moral relativism at the heart of it all. It is obvious that they don't believe in objective truth, the idea that truth is something that corresponds with a reality outside of ourselves. That, in turn, makes them believe that truth is decided by who is the best liar, which make them almost impossible to face in a debate. And last night, the 7th of December 2017, according to the Gregorian calendar, Ivar Arpi had to debate Professor Lena Martinsson, professor of gender science at Gothenburg University, in Opinion Live, the state television debate show that replaced our old debate show, unironically named Debate. According to Lena Martinsson herself, she is completely unaffiliated with the Secretariat, but was only there to defend gender science as a real science. I must say, Ivar was fantastic in the debate. He defended academic freedom, he defended real equality between the sexes, he defended science against ideology. At first, she didn't even listen to him. I don't know about all professors of gender science, but Professor Lena Martinsson was obviously one of those gender scientists that hasn't learned that no means no. But in the end, I think Ivar Arpi did a fantastic job and got his point across with some help from the professor herself. As a funny side note, when I searched for her name on the Secretariat for Gender Research's website, she is in at least 21 articles. The earliest one is all the way back from 2001, where she asks if the class perspective isn't due for a comeback. In the latest article, she is part of a petition for an academic boycott of the United States because of Trump's travel ban, claiming that what's happening in the United States is that, and I quote, "white Christian structures of privileges is strengthened." End quote. More activism than academia and 21 articles says that maybe Professor Lena Martinsson is not as unaffiliated with the Secretariat for Gender Research as she is with the truth. Professor Lena Martinsson also said in Opinion Live that gender science does incorporate biology into its research. That a lot of gender scientists are citing biologists, working with biologists, even are biologists themselves. And interestingly enough, I happen to have an interview with Charlotta Stern, whom Ivar Arpi cited to counter that argument from Professor Lena Martinsson. Right here, for you, now. Charlotta Stern is Associate Professor and Deputy Chair of the Department of Sociology at Stockholm University. For 2 years, she served as consulting editor to American Journal of Sociology. Her research has appeared in American Journal of Sociology, European Sociological Review, Rationality and Society, Acta Sociologica, and Behavior and Brain Science. And I hear she also has a black belt in humility. Enjoy. So, Charlotta Stern, welcome to Deconstructive Criticism.
Thank you so much.
You've been here once before, but unfortunately I had too much beard and it got caught in the microphone and it made a lot of static. So it's not that you were too guarded last time. That was just an excuse to get you back.
I see.
Yes, you're an Associate Professor of Sociology at Stockholm University.
That's correct. I also work for a private research institute called Ratio in Stockholm.
And what does an Associate Professor do?
Well, an associate professor teaches university students and do research most of the time.
And what do you specialize in?
I think of myself as a labor sociologist. I've studied men and women career paths in the labor market, but I've also studied organizational sociology stuff. I started off being a folk movement sociologist, so I studied the folk movements in Swedish history.
What do you mean by folk movements?
The folk movements,
like grassroots political.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So starting with the free church movement in the early is sort of the first real folk movement, or at least the most sort of mass movement in Sweden, and then going to the temperance movement, the socialist movement, the unions, the social democrats, that kind of stuff.
So one could say you're an expert at mass movements.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah. And were you always interested in sociology?
Yeah, more or less, I think. I wasn't necessarily thinking that of myself as wanting to become a sociologist when I started university. I was actually enrolled in an HR program and was thinking that I would be an organizational consultant or some sort of personnel expert.
And then what happened?
Yeah, what happened is that I got my degree, or I finished my studies in 1993, and it was like the worst economic circumstances Sweden had been then in many years, and there was basically no jobs.
Yeah, our currency crashed in 93, I believe.
Yes. So I managed to stay on. I got asked by my advisor, my bachelor thesis advisor, if I wanted to work as a research assistant, and my opportunity cost was like minimal. So He paid me to sit at the university in the summer and read books. It's like the best summer job I ever had.
Yes. And then you realized.
And then I realized that, maybe this is, I'm going to support myself in the future.
So it isn't necessarily that you're really interested in people.
I am really interested in people too, but that I became a professional people person, sort of studying people from a distance is basically what I've specialized in doing, wasn't really part of the plan. I was thinking I would be more of a hands-on person.
All right. And I invited you here because I've read 2 studies of yours.
Mm-hmm.
The first is called The Political Opinions of Swedish Social Scientists.
Yep.
And the second one is called Undoing Insularity, a small study of gender sociology's big problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought we'd start with the political opinions of Swedish social scientists.
Sure.
Why would you make such a study? What's the purpose of a study like that?
Well, it really started much earlier than that, because between, I think, 2004 and 2009, I published a lot of studies on the politics of academics, but mainly in the U.S. So it was a U.S. population.
And how did you fall into that? How did you even come up with the idea that you wanted to study the political attitudes of social scientists?
Well, that was more a random thing, if there is such a thing. But I am married to an American professor, and he had collected data on, he's a political economist, and he had collected data on the politics of academics, actually in a research project dealing with ideological migration, whether or not people change their minds after, the year 25 or,
So they can stay in the same place, but in their mind they travel from one point to another.
Exactly. And so the original survey had people asked people a bunch of questions on when you were 25, what did you think of these things? And then they ask now, as you are now, what do you think of these things? But the survey asked people about political opinions. So that was like the whole rationale of the survey originally. And then, of course, he's a very libertarian type professor. And so he also was curious about the politics of professors, especially since he had, of course, experience during his entire, living in academia that not being a left-wing person is sometimes very controversial.
Yeah.
And so he was interested in knowing exactly how does it pan out and what
and it's also very frustrating because it means you argue with people from different points of view and you don't understand where the other person is coming from, or they don't understand where you're coming from. And then...
Exactly. And so there's a big Yeah, there's a big argument going on, basically, or controversy, or whatever you want to call it. And so we started, and he needed a number cruncher. And so I was the number cruncher, and we started writing on this stuff, and I got really into it, and we published a bunch of stuff.
So what did you find about the political attitudes of American social scientists?
Yeah, we found that in most social science fields, there's a huge domination of Democrats over Republican professors, and left-wing over right-wing professors. And also when it comes to public policies, whether or not you support state interventionists in public domains, there's also a majority of professors think that the government should intervene in all kinds of, domains of private life. And so we started documenting that and looking into different disciplines and different ways of understanding the data. And we did a historical overview in one of these, sort of looking what was it like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and
How did you find that out? How do you? I mean, most of these people must have been dead.
Yes, of course. But you see, there was a previous period in the 60s where a lot of sociologists actually were very interested in the politics of professors, because they thought they were all conservative and right-wing.
Okay, were they right?
No, not really.
Okay.
Not even back then. There was there like a strong sort of domination on the other side, from the other side, but it was much more even back in those days. And so this new situation really is that there's certain fields in which there's basically no alternative political viewpoints. The whole field is like, dominated by a left-wing
paradigm, sort of a ideology, I suppose.
Ideology, I would say, and so and that of course creates all kinds of weird side effects, I think.
Like what? What happens when because you call these these fields insulated, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like they're insulated from outside stimulants.
Yeah, yes. Indeed, and outside ideas, and of course, all social groups. I mean, it's a part of human nature. We gang up with people who are like us, and then we sort of protect the us. I mean, it's, I think, very sort of evolutionary, just how we are. And of course, in most spheres of life, that's perfectly fine. If you go to church with your church people, go ahead. I mean, but it becomes really problematic, I think, in a scientific field, because there you really need to have an openness to ideas and alternative explanations, and test your hypotheses, and nothing should really be sacred.
Yeah.
And then when you start having a majoritarian kind of outlook on life, you become insulated from other alternative interpretations.
And you noticed that had happened in American universities? Yeah,
that has happened in American universities. I mean, to varying degrees. I mean, in political economy in the U.S., the D2R D2R ratio is like 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1, sort of there.
And D2R is Democrats to Republicans.
To Republicans, yes, of course. And so there you see that there are much more of a different ideas are actually like available. So it varies. In sociology, the D2R ratio is somewhere between 16 to 1 to 59 to 1. There's
in the
not
US.
In the U.S.
So that's 60 Democrats for every Republican.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In our survey, we had to actually collapse anthropology and sociology to get sort of a little mass of Republicans to study their opinions.
Oh, really? So they're endangered now.
They're an endangered species. Yeah.
All right. The Republican sociologist. We need to put them all in one big cage and hope that they mate with each other.
Indeed.
All right.
Or something like that. I don't know. Yeah.
So the purpose of the study, because then you wanted to make a similar study on Swedish social scientists. Indeed. To find out what political attitudes they had. And before we go into that, Could you just please briefly explain, because there's some difference between the political spectrum in Sweden and the political spectrum in the United States. So what would the difference be?
Well, first of all, there's we have many more parties, of course. So we have at least 5 or 6 that are part of government, or like the governing set, or the different varieties. And liberals are actually liberals in sort of the classical liberal sense, meaning that they are pro-market,
In Sweden or in the
Sweden.
States?
Yeah, in the United States, liberals are, of course, social democrats, or more social democrats, or at least more left-wing than what we would think of liberals in a Swedish context. Of course, we also have a former communist party as part of these parties, as part of the left wing, so to speak. And of course, then we have the social democrats and the liberal parties being on the right.
Yeah, the liberal parties are on the right in
yes.
Sweden. That is very important to note for the English-speaking listener.
Indeed.
Yes.
So especially for the U.S. listener, because here liberal actually means liberal in sort of the original sense of the word.
Well, at least they aspire to it. But I mean, the entire political spectrum in Sweden is a bit shifted to the left, wouldn't you say? Because we have a welfare state as sort of a founding principle of our nation.
Oh, yeah. No, I think that's probably right. You would find, well, I don't really know. It's very difficult to answer that question, because the left-right, I mean, there's also these, in a U.S. context, you have sort of these conservative Republicans who are not particularly liberal, at least not when it comes to social issues. They might be market liberal, or, fiscally conservative, as some of them say, but so it's really hard to compare political systems, of course, and we have also a Christian Democratic Party, but it's like very small.
Yes,
and
they are on the verge of being kicked out of parliament in next election.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to
if God
compare.
Doesn't save them.
Or the moderate sympathy voters.
Yes,
or,
that is more probable, actually.
I agree with that. So the most important distinction, of course, is that we call liberals right-wing.
Yes.
In a Swedish context, and social democrats and the left party are on the left.
So in this study, what conclusions could you draw after you had made it?
Well, we found that the largest political party among the academics who answered our survey was the Folk Party, or the Liberal Party, which is sort of a middle-of-the-road but right-wing party. But we also found interesting sort of disciplinary differences among the fields that we surveyed. The Folk Party was larger in the econ part of the distribution.
So more Swedish liberals were in economics.
Yes.
And they are non-interventionist.
I'm sorry, they are?
They are more non-interventionist than
non-interventionist than the left wing. And so, but there were, as I said, there were differences. So we also surveyed sociologists, and in sociology, the largest party was the left party, which is, of course, in the general public, one of the smaller parties as well. And we also surveyed gender studies or gender science, or they have different names.
In Sweden, we call it gender science.
Gender science, yeah.
But in English, you call it gender studies.
Gender studies. And the largest party was the Feminist Initiative, very strongly dominated by the
within gender sociology.
Within gender science.
And they're not even in parliament.
They're not even in parliament.
They're a 1 to 2% party.
Exactly. Yeah. And then we had, political science, and that was more normal in some sort of contextual sense, if you think of the Swedish population as normal, because in political science, social democrats were the most common party, which is true also, I believe, in among the general population.
I don't see the Swedish population as normal.
I
just want to say that so everyone knows. So the conclusions are that the political scientists of Sweden, they're not as lefty as the Americans, as you might think.
Not, yeah. It seems not to be
with the
case.
exception of sociology and gender studies.
Yeah. So, and of course there are other social sciences we didn't inquire about, psychology, pedagogics, they might be, we don't know what kind of distributions they have, of course. But among the people we surveyed, this is what we found.
So how did you go about to find out what these people think?
Well, we sent out an email to all faculty that we could find online in these fields. And then, so we had like 4,000 email addresses.
So this is a pretty big study.
Oh, yeah. We tried to really include everyone we could find. And then, of course, we didn't have a huge response rate, but it wasn't too bad. It was like 35%, or if I remember correctly. But at least, it wasn't too bad.
And to find out what political scientists have for a political attitude, that's important, right? Because they participate in society and they influence decision makers.
That's kind of the selection we made was sort of based on thinking that these social sciences are sort of the most relevant when it comes to engaging in public discourse or influencing policymakers or being interested in politics or, So we had a notion of, these fields being of more interest to the public than, chemistry or physics or.
And what you also found out, as I understand it, is that people who are non-interventionist, i.e. more liberal, they are not as politically active as the ones on the left.
Is that right? Yeah, maybe that was one of our
That is one of the problems you point out, that even though the distribution is fairly even,
could be
the lefties are way more politically active. One would even call them activists of some kind. And I mean, all intellectuals paid by the state, as they are in Sweden, if you work at a university, they have to participate in committees and surveys and contribute with their expertise for politicians. But then there's also activism that you can partake in.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yes, and most of the liberals that you seem to have asked, they don't really partake in political activism, whilst on the left they do.
I see. Yeah. That would be, so, that tells you something too that is important to know, of course, is whether you want to be an influencer or not. If you aspire to be a public intellectual, or if you aspire to sit in your office and do your research, right? There are different types of academics.
So if you want to be that type of academic to reap the glory and affect change, then gender sociology is the subject for you, I suppose.
Perhaps.
All right. That's good to know. So just a last question on the political opinions of Swedish social scientists essay. Why was it published in a Finnish economic paper and not a Swedish economic paper?
We aimed actually at publishing it in an international journal, but the why Sweden question was kind of, I don't really know. I mean, maybe it wasn't interesting enough to be published in a sort of U.S. Mainstream political journal. So we decided to submit it to the Finnish economic papers, and they accepted it. So
they tend to accept anything that paints Sweden in a bad light. Over in Finland.
I see. Yes. So you think they were interested in just being mean to us? I don't really know. But we also published actually a Swedish version in Ekonomisk Debatt, which is a Swedish journal written in Swedish. So there's a Swedish version of our paper available to the interested reader, perhaps.
All right. And then let's move on to the second study, because this study is really the reason I invited you, because this study is called Undoing Insularity, a small study of gender sociology's big problem, which is a very, very nice headline, I think. But you'd have to explain what insularity means.
Sure. So insularity basically means, we touched upon it when we talked about why it would be a problem that certain disciplines are taken over or dominated by a single type of political views. It means that you stop taking in influences from outside your own group. So and as I said, I think it's a very natural thing for humanity. I think we have this kind of instinct of doing this, being insular and listening to ourselves, sort of.
And the other term you use in this paper, which I think you owe me an explanation for, is blinkered.
Blinkered, of course, is what you do with a horse when you put up little pads,
blinds,
little blinders on their eyes so that they don't see to the sides and are not, threatened by, if something flaps or whatever.
Promoting monovision, basically.
It's promoting monovision and sort of shielding you from input or from, distressing
input. Yes.
Yeah.
So why did you do a study like this about just sociology? Why did you focus on sociology? How come you made the study?
Well, I'm a sociologist, right? So it's kind of
what you do.
Classic is like what you know,
yes.
I would say, more than what you do. But this paper really started as a blog post. I was thinking that I would write a blog post about gender sociology for heterodox.org.
Which is what?
Which is a website that is promoting political diversity in academia, or rather sort of, it's a kind of, it has a mission of spreading political diversity to university campuses.
So trying to mix up the social scientists with some Republicans and maybe some STEM field scientists with some socialists.
Sociologists or socialists, yeah, whatever. It is. It was started by Jonathan Haidt and a bunch of other people to create community, but also because more and more academics started actually voicing concern about diversity issues. And of course, the academic world celebrates diversity in all kinds of other areas, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, but viewpoint diversity has not really been part of that whole, shebang. And so Heterodox Academy sort of was a way of collecting people who sort of enforced or endorsed this notion that we need to address this issue of a lack of
So basically it collects people who can only agree that disagreement is the best thing.
Exactly.
All right. And Jonathan Haidt, of course, is a famous moral psychologist.
Indeed. He
has written The Righteous Mind about what type of biases that influence you and makes you become a socialist or a conservative or a libertarian.
And also has very good notions about why you find other people who don't share your moral conviction disgusting, or why you feel offended by people who don't agree with you. So he's a very good he's a very good person to talk about these issues because he's obviously the expert, right?
And he's one of the few people who have migrated in his mind as well, isn't he? Because he started out as a Democrat or an American liberal, and then he has drifted into American conservatism, I suppose.
I'm not sure that he would say that himself. I don't really, I can't really speak for him, but I do think that his studies of these issues have made him understand that it's much more complicated than just being a committed this or that. And of course, as a sort of liberal-leaning person myself, I'm hoping that he has seen the light, right? I'm hoping that he's now one of ours. But I don't really know. And I think that he doesn't really, take sides.
No, and it doesn't. It's maybe not the most important thing to.
It isn't. No. He's very sympathetic to the idea that political diversity is really important.
But he asked you to elaborate on this blog post.
He did not actually. So it started with me being contacted by a group of social psychologists, and they asked me, given my expertise, being a sociologist, sort of closely related to social psychology, and having written previously on political views of academics, if I wanted to go author something about social psychology. And, among the authors were Jonathan Haidt, Philip Tetlock, Lee Jussim, and then two guys that I hadn't heard about previously, Jose Duarte and Jared Crawford. All of them like really excellent people who had been working in related fields, sort of touching upon diversity issues in their own research, and sort of coming to the idea that this is something, we have a problem in social psychology. And so I agreed to be a co-author, and we worked together on this paper that was published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 2015. And it's called Political Diversity Will Improve Social Psychological Science. It's a really good paper. I recommend everyone to read this paper.
I hope you send me a link so I can,
sure,
post a link beneath the episode.
Oh yeah, no, that would be great. It's available online, Anyway, so I've been now spending some time, and I was really done with this academic political thing, because I was. It's not a way to make friends, and it's really kind of been there, done that.
People tend to get annoyed when you try to pin them into some sort of little hole where they're supposed to fit, right?
Yeah, and like most people, academics don't really like to be guinea pigs and studied, and especially not when it comes to politics, I think. But so I was done with this, I thought. And then after this BBS piece was published, Lee Jussim and Jared Crawford approached me again and said, would you be interested in writing something about how political ideology, is damaging science? And so I was thinking first that, how, do I want to do that? And then I was thinking that, well, I sort of have a duty to do that because, I signed on to heterodoxacademy.org, and I, of course, have been thinking about ways that people have blinkers. And then, I've worked on gender study. Yeah, so they approached me about this project, and they wanted to do a whole book with examples on how political ideology actually damages people's ideas. And so closest to my own experience and my own research was gender. And I've been exposed to all kinds of instances during my whole career where sort of dissenting views on gender has been either, sort of sneered at or just not ever.
Could you give an example?
Well, for instance, I've been in seminars. So I've been in seminars where someone has brought up the name Catherine Hakim, who's a British sociologist, famous for writing on preferences of women and men being different. And she's been working in this field and documented how women and men have different preferences when it comes to work and family life. And so people sometimes bring that up in seminar discussions on, when someone presents a paper and they say, oh, but how about if you looked at this from a preference point of view, and people would just say, no, I don't want to quote her. And, as a scientist, or at least an intellect trying to explore different ideas and different explanations, it seems very odd to me to sort of like, I don't want to even go there. I don't want to talk about that. And then, of course, in the whole evolutionary movement or Darwin 2.0 has happened. And I also started, thinking how that would affect, how that affects all these studies on gender differences.
That has been made so far, because they've been made from a social constructionist view, which means that they think that everything is socially constructed and has nothing to do with biology. So your gender and my gender is decided not on our biological sex, but on culture and the fact that we
treat us. Yeah. And expectations from others and all kinds of ways that are like affecting how we think of ourselves and our belief systems.
So you made a study then on gender sociology.
I did.
And how did you do it?
So I started from a paper called Doing Gender that was published a long time ago.
1987.
1987. And
by Don Zimmerman and Candace West.
Yes. And it's a sort of the most highly cited paper in a journal called Gender and Society, which is the top-notch journal in gender studies, I would say, and it's a top-ranked journal also in sociology. So it's like a famous paper in a famous journal, very highly regarded, and establishing the notion of doing gender. And doing gender is of course, the sort of trying to capture all these ways that we are constructing gender every day in our when we engage, when we eat dinner, when we whatever.
When you put on your clothes, when you put on your makeup, when you laugh a bit in a high-pitched laugh at a man's joke.
Exactly.
Or, yes. Or as a man, expect a woman to laugh high-pitched at your joke.
At your joke, yeah. And so it's like for me, it's a very important paper, but it's also a paper that is very sort of typical hardcore social constructivist. So I figured, that was published many years ago, and since then a lot of things have happened, of course, in the sort of new evolutionary science field, if you want to just call that all that stuff that's going on in that field just evolutionary. And I thought that, one of the major things that have happened since then was the publication of Steven Pinker's book called The Blank Slate in 2002. Basically challenging, the blank slate and the modern denial of human nature, right? It's like, bam, here's a challenge to you guys, right?
It's a direct attack.
It's a direct attack. And he's quite polemical or sometimes pushing things perhaps too far in my view, but it's clear that he is challenging.
He's seen a problem with sociology and he has gathered all the evidence against it, and he has published it in a book. And he says, here, what do you say about that?
Exactly. With a title that's a direct affront on doing gender. I mean, not, of course, specifically, but on that kind of thinking. And so when you want to investigate whether or not someone is insular, how do you go about doing it? And I didn't really I don't really know anyone having done this before. So I just thought, well, this is a book. What's its impact on this field, right? And so
the impact should be huge. He attacks the entire field.
He attacks the entire field. He has a whole chapter on gender differences.
So 2 years later, everyone has read it and changed their minds.
Indeed. Yes. That's how things should work, right?
Yes.
In the marketplace of ideas, you would think that, competing ideas is put forward. And, as a scientist, we would put these like, oh, here's a new idea. What would that mean? How would I test it? How would I go about investigating whether it has some merit? So basically, I started thinking that Pinker's book would be a good starting point for thinking that here's someone, screaming loud. And so I figured that I would test the idea by using doing gender and people citing doing gender as thinking that these are people in the field of gender, right? So
you took out essays. That's one of the references was the article by Candace West and Don Zimmerman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I took for every article that had been published since 2004, thinking that they must have some time to read Pinker, and then up to 2014.
So a 10-year period.
10-year period, and I took out the two most highly cited journal articles from during that period. So I started off with 23 articles because one was tied. The second place was tied. So I took out all three. And I read all these articles with, Pinker in mind and basically coded them as, blinkered, non-blinkered, was gender, was biological difference ideas pertinent to the argument or not?
So how many articles in total did you study?
So in total, I found I had a sample of, I think, 23 articles. And of those articles, 3 was not relevant. They cited doing gender, but in a sort of non-relevant way.
They were
didn't
talking
actually,
about just
they were
culture
totally-
anyway, so they didn't
one
have
of them
to.
was like doing gender articles as one example of when you use a word to do a noun or whatever. And so I sorted those out. So I had a sample then in the end of 20 articles that I was, that, in some fashion or other dealt with gender. And
so 20 articles that deal with gender.
Yeah.
They are all social constructionists at the base, so to speak. They have
Well, not
social...
necessarily, but they cite doing gender as part of the references.
And then you thought that if they cite doing gender and these articles are relevant for biological difference ideas, they should be citing biological difference literature as well.
Exactly.
So that's what you tested them for.
That's kind of what I was interested in exploring. And so...
And how many of the 20 articles you studied did reference biological difference ideas?
One. And
one out of 20?
1 out of 20.
So 5%?
Yeah. And 15 of the articles I considered blinkered. And I
completely monomanic, doesn't look outside their fields.
Ignore biological difference ideas or dismiss biological difference ideas as not relevant.
When they are relevant.
When they are relevant. So blinkered, when I said that 15 of the 20 were blinkered, I judged them to have improved if they had considered biological difference ideas. It seemed to me that these articles could have been, worth more if they had also included some notion of biological differences as part of the theorizing, or as part of the alternative explanations, as part of something that had to do with the scientific argument.
So in 10 years, more than 10 years actually, 15 years now, nothing has happened.
It's of course hard to know. This is a very small survey, of course, and what's important to remember is that it's influential articles. It's the most highly cited articles in these years that cite the Doing Gender article. So these are like the coolest people in the field in many ways, right?
They are the leaders. They have the power, they have the funding, they have the right to make decisions on who gets funding.
Yeah, and they are the ones with graduate students and names and everything like that, of course. In many ways. And of course, it's talking about ideological migration again. Of course, these people are not going to change their minds, perhaps, because they're sort of...
You can't learn an old dog new tricks.
Well, at least it's harder. They invested a lot in becoming spokespeople for this movement, right?
Yes, in some cases, they've built their careers on this theory.
Of course.
Yes.
And so, they are not really perhaps the most likely to be open to new ideas, right? And so I don't really know what's going on underneath that surface. There might be new things happening in this field that I don't capture in my little survey. But I do think that the general gist of my argument is true. I do think that gender sociology is insulated, and I think they are insulated because of ideology. Because
where they develop
ideology.
Certain taboos, and they can't approach those taboos, and in those taboos lies the answers they need to develop their field of study.
Yeah, I think that partly it's because they're left-wing feminists, and left-wing feminists have a specific notion of what an equal society means. And an equal society means that there are very slim differences between men and women. So that is sort of the utopia, right?
Because every difference is seen as an injustice.
Yeah,
yes.
As inequality. And so everything that sort of points to differences becomes a problem, right? And so I think that partly that whole ideology of slim differences is behind this blinkeredness, because everything that says, maybe there are temperamental differences between men and women, that means that they don't thrive in the same areas of working life, means that no, you're saying that there can't be a society
women firemen
or police officers or whatever in the finance sector competing for the highest bid or whatever, and so it becomes problematic to acknowledge that maybe there are, maybe we're just different.
And how have your colleagues reacted since you published this?
Well, I had a seminar in my department after I published the Insularity article. It was full. I think it was the most
attended
event seminar
in
since
sociology
many
history.
years.
Yes.
Which of course is fun, but it was also a bit scary, obviously, because I'm not actually like a person who likes conflict, believe it or not.
No, I do believe you.
But I also think that if you're serious about science, or if you're serious about being a scholar, you also have a big responsibility to speak up when even if it's uncomfortable. So I presented the paper in my department, and I had some harsh, not so hard I mean, we're in Sweden after all.
As you
so
said,
people
you're not a very conflict-seeking person, so I have a very hard time believing that you went full screaming into the lecture.
No, I didn't. I tried to be very reasonable and not overstating my things. So it was very highly attended, and I think that some of my colleagues were angry with me, but I also think that there were other colleagues that were like, finally, someone is actually daring to say this out loud.
Yes.
Since I've published this piece, I've had fan mail,
which
for
is
the
quite
first
unusual for a sociologist, I can imagine.
It is, and not of course not hundreds, but perhaps 5 emails from professors in other countries or elsewhere saying like, thank you for being so courageous and actually saying these things out loud and so on. So I think of myself as doing my duty.
Go where no sociologists have ever gone before.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Because you published this in 2015, right? Yes.
Yep.
So that it's only 2 years now. And the reason I wanted to invite you, I mean, maybe I shouldn't bring it up, but we have a journalist in Sweden called Ivar Arpi, and he was interviewed in Killet, and he's been I guess on his own crusade against gender science in Sweden. And one of the things he's taken issue with is the Secretariat for Gender Studies, which is a government-funded, I guess you call it a PR agency for gender research. Yeah. And they wrote an answer to his articles.
I see.
In DN just a week
Recently.
ago, where they said that there are critiques against gender science, but it only comes from people who are right-wing populists.
Yeah. And there you have it.
Yes.
So now I'm also a right-wing populist.
Well, I'm sorry to say, but it doesn't seem better than that.
Yeah.
And I've been a right-wing populist for quite some time, so I'm not, too upset about it.
You're used to that.
So,
I am not.
So in the end, you came to the conclusion that gender sociology, at least from your study, has a big problem.
Yeah. And I've also written a book chapter on called Does Political Ideology Hinder Insights on Gender and Labor Markets? That was published in this book that I mentioned previously. And there I try to give more examples of issues where I think that these kind of blinkered ideas sort of hinder knowledge development in different ways.
Well, I'm very glad that you came by, at least, because I think this is information that people need.
Yeah, I do too. And I think that academic freedom, I mean, one of the most serious threats to academic freedom is actually self-censorship, that people dare not investigate certain ideas because there's taboos against them. And I do think that actually putting things out there, if you're a tenured sociologist professor,
as you are,
as I am,
you're untouchable.
I am untouchable, perhaps.
Yes. Well, at least when it comes to, your salary, you can still be frozen out by your colleagues.
I can, but yeah, no, I don't think there's. I have friends in my surroundings, so
let's hope they stay friends. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Deconstructive Criticism with Charlotta Stern. I'm Aron Flam, and thank you if you have become a Patreon or swished me at 0768 943737 or Bitcoin me. I am truly grateful for your support. Without your support, I couldn't keep this going. This podcast is growing, so obviously, however you're sharing this podcast, and you're not doing it publicly, but it's working. I have also enabled download because apparently that wasn't on, and with some luck, t-shirts are available at my website when I have a new website, which is soon, hopefully within the week. Keep listening, keep sharing. Until next time, have a good unit of time. And also thank you to the listener who corrected my English on that.